Hello and welcome back to Guzzoline Garage. My name's Eddie and today we're going to be covering overhauling this Eaton TVS 1900 Supercharger. So the Eaton TVS 1900 was fitted to a few different cars over the years. I think certain models of Cadillac, Corvette, Camaro, things like that. The V6 F-Type was fitted with the Eaton TVS 1320 Supercharger, and the overhaul procedures for that should be broadly similar. TVS stands for Twin Vortice Series, which is the technology they used on these chargers, and 1900 refers to the fact it displaces 1.9 litres of air. Also new on the channel today is this little microphone. Hopefully you'll now be able to understand what I'm actually saying from time to time. And that helps because you'll get the same volume if I'm stood here, or if I'm stood really close to the camera, or even if I'm really far away. So we're going to have a look now at taking the intake manifolds off the Supercharger and stripping that down a bit further. So those bolts in there are T40 as well. So I think there's just that 10mm it looks like. Yeah, that feels like that's got it. A couple of locating dowels. We'll grease those before we reassemble it. So on the Supercharger itself then, this here is an oil drain plug, so we can change the oil inside the bearings of the Supercharger while we're at it. And one of the main sort of things I was interested in for the Supercharger itself is changing out the sprung-loaded coupling, which sort of sits in the nose here somewhere. And if you listen carefully, there's a little bit of free play in that. Not lots and lots, but enough. And particularly with the inlet manifolds on, they act like a bit of a sounding chamber for it, and it rings a bit like a bell. So if you're stopping your engine and you hear a sort of clonking, rattling noise, a bit like somebody tapping a spanner on something aluminium, then it's quite likely that your Supercharger coupler has gone. So we'll start taking off the ring of bolts that hold the nose cone on. I think that's it. I was just looking at the bypass valve end because it wouldn't surprise me if there was one hidden in that end, and I've actually, as I'm talking, I've just found it. It's that one in there, isn't it? I've got to try extra hard. Don't drop that bolt into the Supercharger. The Supercharger's fitted with these little gaps in the casting here and here, to enable you to get a pry bar in there to try and break this seal, because I think this is just like a black gasket gunk. So let's have a go. I think it might be workbench time. Sadly I let you down, I didn't get it on camera. It went with a bit of a pop and a ping all at once. You can see how soft the aluminium is here. It started to spool, and that was with hardly any pressure whatsoever. But the charger cap is loose. It's another of them with the little steel dowel pins in, so they'll probably want greasing for reassembly. But that is your charger coupler off, or the nose cone I should say. And then this is the little damper or rubber coupler, and that's the other end of the nose cone there. So we'll check the bearings here, make sure we're happy with them, and then we'll look at taking the rubber damper out. Looking at the snout or nose cone then, so I'm led to believe in here there's two bearings, one at either end of the shaft. and this runs really nice and freely. I can't feel any forward and backward play in the shaft, no end float as such, no wobble at that end, and I can't really feel anything concerning that end either. These bearings do fail or wear, I think because it's quite a long leverage kind of piece for the tension on the belt to be driving the Charger, which is quite a long way away. So the bearings would see quite high load, I would imagine. There's a little bit of oil dotted around here and there, whether that's come out of the bearings or it's grease or engine oil maybe. Not too sure at this point. What is worth looking at is the tip of this drive arrangement for where the flexible coupling goes. So one of the reasons we're here and one of the reasons we're doing this is because these can get damaged by the coupling. So I don't know if you can quite see this very well on camera or not. Can you see there's like a little rusty stripe just behind this pin on the actual main shaft? And that's where the spring of the flexible coupler has actually started to eat into this shaft. Now it's very, very minimal here and barely perceptible, but you can feel it just with your fingernail. There's just the slightest gouge coming. They do go worse than that, so pay attention to the condition of yours and see what yours is like. So my snout's in fairly good order. Moving on to the Charger itself, the sprung-loaded coupling should just wiggle out like that. Now there's two sizes of these. This is the smaller type. This is an early V8 model, and at some point the V8 cars changed to the same size as the V6 models. I've preemptively bought myself another coupler. So this is what I bought thinking I needed it. Unfortunately, this is the wrong part for me and my car. But this is the correct part for a V6 model, and it's the correct part for a later V8 as well. So this is a genuine Eaton part from Superchargers online. There's your part number there. And this is just a very hard nylon type material, and it eliminates the spring which goes rusty, snaps and fails and gouges the shaft. So you'd get a more sort of solid direct drive with that, but there is some flexibility in it as well, although it's very, very tough. What I've got instead is a brand new original sprung loaded coupler. The reason for that is there is some issue with the 1900s and the early V8 models. They suffer from harmonics when they are fitted with a solid coupler, and you get some sort of resonant or vibration type issue going on. So we just got exactly the same to replace it with, like for like, and then hopefully the spring in that one will last us another good few thousand miles at least. Looking at the tail end of the Supercharger, then we've got a little hex key drain plug and a few 10mm bolts to take off that cover and have a look at the timing gears inside. So to get the drain plug out of the back, I'm using a 3/16 Allen key, and we'll get a suitable drain receptacle and leave it draining for a while. This oil as well absolutely stinks. It's not like sulphur like normal gear oil, it's something different. It smells like rotten bananas or something. So while the main body drains dry of oil, we're going to move on to looking at the snout. Now there's nothing wrong with my snout that I can really tell. Everything spins nice and freely. The end of the shaft isn't too badly gouged where the old coupler was starting to give up. But because I've got the bearings anyway and I'm here, I think I'm going to just replace them, because I don't want in 5,000 miles, 10,000 miles, the bearings on this snout to fail and me to have to do all this work all over again. Just makes sense as a while you're there job. One of the first things to do is remove this little cover that's hiding the end of the Supercharger pulley. Ping! And it's just a little plastic cap over the end. And you can see that the pulley isn't particularly secured by much. They're like a friction fit on the shaft basically. So now all we've got is the snout assembly with the pulley and a puller. This is a gear puller. It's not the ideal tool for the job, but I haven't got a specific pulley tool. So I'm just going to give this a little go, and we're going to use the impact gun to try and get this pulled off. Okay, not too bad. And with the pulley now off this shaft, we should be able to just give the shaft a little bit of a tap, and hopefully it'll come out the underside. And then that's the shaft, with the bearing still on at this end, and the other bearing is still in the Supercharger snout housing. So with the shaft here in some soft jaws on the vise, we've got this bearing and this flange. This flange again is a press fit, needs to come off the shaft before we can get this bearing off. And so we've managed to pull that drive flange off the shaft, and this bearing just needs to be pulled off as well, so we're going to do the same with that. So with the bearing and the drive flange removed from the shaft, we're done with that bit. We can place it to one side. So with the snout held upside down, the bearing that we need to drift out is at the bottom here. A 3/4 inch extension bar seems to fit relatively nicely to use as a drift suitable for the bearing. And there we've managed to drift the other bearing out. One snout, both bearings removed. And having a slightly closer look at the bearing we've just drifted out, that's the plain side that we could see. Everything looks alright. On the inner side that was sort of hidden in the snout, you can see that the grease has started to leach out, so the seal was starting to wear out on that bearing. As it spun, it would have eventually thrown out all of its grease, and then that would have led to the bearing dying fairly rapidly, so it's probably a good job that we've done that while we're here. So now we're looking at the rebuild kit for the Charger, and for our trouble we've paid £342. We get this bottle of oil, syringe to do the draining and filling with, these two needle roller bearings which are for the actual rotor pack itself, and two roller bearings for the snout that we've just removed, with a nice new coupler. Now we've got the snout apart, we'll just carry on with that and we'll get the snout back together, I think, and put these two bearings in and the shaft. So we're going to put the pulley end bearing in first, and any swarf, grit or dust is going to shorten the life of that bearing, so we're going to give it all a thorough clean out before we put any new stuff in. So as I say, make sure it's totally dust, grit, any sort of contamination free, because anything small is likely to work its way into the bearing over time, wear out the dust seal, get all the grease out of it faster, and that's when you'll end up with an early failed bearing. So this is my old bearing, and this has got part number on it of Bravo Delta 17-31 Delta Uniform Mike 8. Nice new one then. Can be fitted either way around. First thing I'm going to do is just take a little finger of ball bearing grease and use that to grease the housing where it's going to sit. You don't want too much because you'll only contaminate things, I guess, but this is to just help it slide into its position nicer without gouging or getting stuck on any of the aluminium. And then we'll just rub the excess on the outer edge of the bearing like that. Now the most ideal way to assemble a bearing like this is in a press. I don't have that luxury at the moment, so you could do it in a vise, but I don't think my vise will open quite long enough for the length of the snout. I might give that a little go. If not, I'll have to get it seated just gently with a hammer at first, very gentle taps on the outer race only, and then a socket that fits perfectly to get it seated fully home. Let's have a quick look at that then. And then using this Halford's 30mm socket, look, which fits onto the outer race of the bearing only, we can carry on drifting that home. And that is the bearing fully seated. Same sort of deal going on with the new shaft bearing. We've wiped the shaft, made sure it's immaculately clean. So the next thing I'm going to do, take a dobbin of grease, grease her up, and that will help just aid the reassembly there. We're going to do something slightly different to install this bearing. So the last bearing, we taps it home using the outer race of the bearing, and what that does is it avoids loading the actual bearing components, the inner balls or rollers or tapers, whatever, and puts the load only on the outer race, which is fairly rigid. Now this time around, because it's going on a shaft, if I was to hit it on the outer race, I would then load all of the bearing components while the inner race came home on this step. So we're going to drive it on the inner race. Again, we're going to use a socket to drift it on, and we're going to use a deep socket obviously because of the shaft in the way. So I've got a 17mm deep socket, and that's going to allow us to get over the shaft and just touch the inner race only, which will allow us to drift the bearing on without loading any of the bearing rollers or the outer race. We've only got to go 4 or 5mm anyway, so let's just give that a tickle. That is fully home as it sits. And one of the next things we need to be looking at is fitting this drive flange back onto the little spline section here where it came off. And I've done the same thing, wipe the shaft nice and clean, smear a tiny bit of grease on, and then we're going to gently drift the shaft up to those splines. And that then is now finally fully home. So now with the bearing shaft fitted loosely into the hole, we've got a bit of play at the top because the top bearing isn't seated into its recess, and the shaft isn't sticking out as far as it should for the pulley end. So in an ideal world, what I'd do now is support this in a press and hydraulic press the top of the shaft into place and do a bit of jiggery pokery to make sure everything's definitely fully seated where it should be. But I don't have a hydraulic press, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to gently try and seat it in the top here. It is only the shaft passing through the inner, so it shouldn't put up too much of a fight. If it does, I'll either have to go and buy a press or go to one of my local garages and bung them 20 quid to use the press for a few minutes. Let's have a look. Okay, so the shaft's come through a bit more and the top bearing's just starting to seat, which is what we want. I don't really want to pound on it any more than I currently have for the reasons I've just outlined. Okay, so a couple of days ago we left off with a problem of not having a hydraulic press, and as you might be able to notice, we've now got a hydraulic press. I'll probably use this once a year, so that's a great investment. Now, we're ready and set up to press the snout bearing into position. So what we had was the nose end bearing, if you like, seems to be sat roughly where it wants to be. A 30mm socket was what we drifted that into place with on the outer race. And we're trying to seat this top bearing here, that's going to be the inner bearing that sits with the coupler. So this bearing needs to slide in by approximately 10mm there. As we press that into position, it's likely to try and press this one back out. So we're going to keep it rested on the outer race on a 30mm socket there, so that we don't stress the bearing, because we're just going to hold the outer race exactly where we want it. And we're going to push this one in with a 17mm socket which fits over the shaft, so it's going to push against the drive flange, which should help mate those up better as well. So let's do that. Now it is quite important to get it level and central as good as we can, and always keep an eye on it. Go slow and steady. You don't always need loads of force to get this done. And that feels like it's gone fully home. We're starting to get a flicker of pressure on the gauge at the top of the press there. So just up here, we've not got anywhere near a ton. We've probably got about, according to that, something like 500 kilos of force on that now. But that's plenty. It's stopped moving, stopped making noises. So I'd say that's fully home. So with that piece pressed together then, the bearing's gone fully into where it should live. Shaft still spins nice and freely. And we've got more shaft sticking out this other end as well. Everything feels silky smooth.
Good boy. That's a good boy.
So we're looking at the main body of the Supercharger again then, and we're going to try and start taking this apart. The difficulty we've got here is this flange is very similar to the drive flange on the other end of the snout. This is where the rubber coupler sits, and we've got to pull this off before we can take the rotor pack and the bearings out. So that could be difficult. Now you may notice that it looks like we've got a coating of some black film on here, and it looks to me, it's really thick, horrible, black nasty stuff, and it's very grease-like in appearance. But it doesn't particularly feel gritty, I wouldn't say. It sort of looks black, but when you get a small bit of it on its own, it's got this bluish tinge to it as well, if you can see that right on the tip of my finger. So I think what that is it's the blue grease that's in the bearings from factory that's then mixed with the bits of bearing as the bearing's broken down and formed this graphite-y type paste. Because my bearing on this one, hopefully you can hear that slight metallic rattling or clicking, and that's because there is some play in that bearing at the top end. Now, whether that's a normal amount of play or whether it's because this bearing has failed, I'm not too sure at the moment, but we're about to try and find out, I suppose. So we're still trying to get the drive flange out of the charger here with these 3 triangular bolt holes by inserting an M6 thread in each of them bolt holes and using a puller. This is a new puller I've bought, Nielsen Tools CT4400, and unfortunately even on their narrowest setting, the triangular shape still isn't quite narrow enough. It's only just not there, so I think if I tickle each of these grooves with an angle grinder down to this boss for the drive screw, we might get away with it, so I'm going to go do that now. Okay, so we're set up and ready. What we've done is we've screwed our M6 bolts in, we've had to give these M6 washers a little haircut, and I have tickled it with a grinder and then used a little round file just to finish off the grooves down at the bottom. We've still got plenty of meat left on the boss, so that's the little drive screw for the puller inserted, and without further ado, I suppose we ought to give it a blast. Well, by Jove, we've got it. There is a lot of grease there around that bearing, so it does look like that bearing's probably failed and leaked all its grease out, and that's maybe why I've got that rattle. Now that we've got the drive flange pulled off from the other end, we're going to take this back cover off. Now, we had it open at the drain plug to drain all the oil out, but I'm pretty sure we didn't get everything out because a very, very small quantity came out. So we're going to give it the cover off, and then we'll probably have to tip it a little bit more and get the rest of the oil out. Let's go with these. These are all 10mm bolts. And the other thing to say is these ones I've put blue marks on. I've put corresponding blue marks on the casing, because these 3 holes are where the Simposer assembly bolts go into, I think. And although we are actually going to delete the Simposer later on, there'll be more on that in another video, it's probably important that these go back where they came from. So if you can see in there, that's still got a good pool of oil in there. So we didn't get all of it out through the drain hole. If you have a look at the casting, the drain hole is really quite high up, and then it's got a good recessed lip around it as well. So it's very tough to get everything out of that. If you're going to do the oil change in the car, even with the syringe and the tubing, you're going to have to get right over to the side and down into the bottom of the rotor gear packs to be able to change that properly. So with all that oil tipped out, I've measured it in one of the best kitchen jugs that I could find, and we've got a smidge over 120 millilitres drained out. There was some residue obviously still stuck in the gear casing at the moment, some residue on the drip tray that I used, and I did spill a tiny bit as well. The recommended fill on this is 150 millilitres, and indeed the fresh new bottle comes filled to 155 millilitres even. So we've maybe lost a tiny bit of oil, or it was maybe slightly underfilled. It is quite dark in colour though, which gives me an indication on the Supercharger's overall health. I'm not massively happy with the colour on that, especially when you compare it to the new stuff. Now we're going to do the same sort of technique, pry bar again. This is obviously the rotor pack that's going to come out now. And so there we have the spinny bits. So I'm just going to leave the rotor pack upended so that the dregs of the oil can drain out. You can see how that's the shorter shaft, so that just sits in a plain bearing. And this one is the drive rotor, if you like. So we've got the splines along the top here where the drive flange is pressed on. And then we'll have a look at getting the bearings out of the case. So unfortunately here I had some technical difficulties with the new microphone. But the next step is to remove what you can of these bearings. You need to break apart the plastic bearing cages with something like a chisel and a hammer, or maybe a long screwdriver like I'm using, and remove the grease seals. There's an inner and outer grease seal on each bearing, and there's a plastic cage inside which holds all of the needle rollers. So break apart the plastic cage and pry out the grease seals. This should leave the hard stainless steel outer race in place. Take care not to damage the aluminium alloy of the housing. Be careful where you're placing your screwdriver or chisel tip. And once you've removed all of the needle rollers, the plastic bearing cage and the grease seals, you'll want to spray some solvent or brake cleaner, something along those lines, and try and clean out as much grease as you can. This is because we then need to use a tool called an internal bearing puller with a slide hammer to remove these bearings. It's much easier without the plastic bearing cage and the needle rollers in the way, and we've got fresh ones to go in, so don't worry about destroying these. So I've taken the liberty of slide hammering one of the bearings out. This is the outer race as it sits. It went in with the ridged end in towards the end of the casing there. And then inside it's kind of mirror imaged. There's two lips internally. Now I figured it would be easier to show you this with the bearing out and disassembled. So I'll show you the technique and then we'll fast forward while we do the next one. Your bearing puller kit comes looking a bit like this then. We've got two what I'm going to call mandrels down here and what I'm going to call collets here as well. So for our particular bearing size we need this collet and this mandrel which go together. So this end, if you look here, it's got very, very fine lips along the top here, and when we insert the mandrel and screw it tight, because of its cone shape inside, it will start to spread the end of this open. It's very, very marginal, but it does expand quite a bit. Hopefully you can see that V forming there. So now that's expanded, it won't actually fit in that hole very well. So if I shrink it back down again, it'll go into the bearing like that, and it can pass all the way through, which is not really what we want. We're going to try and do it just on this first lip, and the reason for that is because we'll expand less of the overall bearing and it will grip less on the hole. So we put it in as shallow as we can and then we tighten it. To tighten it, again, you don't want to go totally overboard, so you've got a snug fit but it's not going to come out is kind of the sweet spot. But that's quite difficult when it's internal to the supercharger, because you've got to get in with a spanner and it's quite deep, and then a socket wrench to tighten it. Once you think you've got it tight enough and assembled, then we put the rod on like this. This is the slide hammer, so this is just a heavy piece of steel that acts as a handle, and then an end cap, if you like, to stop the end flying off. And the idea then with this tool is that as that bearing is seated in its housing, we can slide that hammer like that to gradually pull it out of its hole. Now it's harder than just saying it. It is quite a difficult job, long, laborious, so let's see how we get on with the next one. So in the bottom there we've got the collet tool just applied to our first bearing. Then we're going to screw in the slide handle, and then it's a case of just sliding the hammer upwards like this to get that bearing out. Ah, well, that's changed a bit since last time you saw it, hasn't it? So I bet you're wondering what the fuck is that idiot doing now. Long story short, it's been 28 degrees Celsius here, or 82 Fahrenheit if you're so inclined, and it's just too hot, man, for doing that slide hammering. It was getting me nowhere. So I've still got the collet and the mandrel and stuff in there from the slide hammer, but then I've got just a length of random M12 threaded bar, about 1,000 washers, and a nut, and the idea of this is it should hopefully convert it into a puller through this big drilled plate as well, and by tightening that I should be able to draw the rod up, which will pull the bearing out at the same time. It's very homebrew. I've put so many washers on because if I didn't I'd have to chop the rod, and I didn't want to chop the rod for no reason because I'm probably only going to use this once. So without further ado, let's give it a go, see what happens. Well, it only bloody worked, didn't it, eh? Brilliant. So now then, with the bearings in a big messy pile here, we should just have the bare casing with nothing much else going on. And our next job will be to clean everything. So I'm going to try and get rid of this sort of engine oil slash sealant crusting here. We're going to clean out all the bolt holes. Over on the other side, we've still got the silicone from where the snout was attached as well. So we're going to run around and clean absolutely all of this, get it immaculate before pressing the new bearings in, because we don't want to put the bearings in, then clean stuff and have bits of silicone and sealant and that falling into the new bearings and contaminating them. So for the rotor pack, notice I haven't got the shaft nipped in the vise because I don't want to mark it, that would be a terrible idea. But I do need to get around the top here and give all this a good clean out. Just to reiterate the importance of the cleanliness here, obviously once this is all built and put back together, it should be a sealed unit. So any amount of dirt, dust, grit, bits of extra bearing, aluminium, chunks, whatever, is going to be trapped in there forever with the gear oil on the gear end and the grease in the bearings as well. So that will shorten the lifespan considerably if it's not absolutely clean. The next thing to do is to press the bearings into the casing, the needle roller bearings at the front end. There is a depth that they need to be set to. I'll put that on the screen here because I can't remember it off the top of my head. And once that's done, it'll be a fairly quick job to sealant around all the supercharger bits, i.e. the rotor pack, where that goes in, that wants sealant, and then the gear casing over the top wants sealant as well, and then that all gets bolted down and torqued together as a oneer. And then pop the snout on at our leisure. I'll give it a little bit of time to cure on the sealant. You shouldn't, in theory, need any time for it to cure because it's all wedged in such a tight gap, but a couple of hours won't hurt, and then I'll refill it with the oil. So in much the same way as we fitted our snout bearings, we're going to use the hydraulic press. The only issue we've got is that the press bed is obviously hard steel, the body is aluminium, and it can quite easily damage it. So I'm just going to use these couple of bits of sacrificial plywood. Very similar to how we fitted the snout bearings, I'm going to put a tiny bit of grease into each hole just to aid the aluminium sliding into position. Really not much. And that should help the new bearings slide in nicely. Looking at each new bearing then, you'd think they were identical. However, they're not quite, because on the other side, one's got a grease seal and the other one hasn't. The reason for this is that that one goes into the open hole and this one goes into the blind hole. If it's a blind hole, it's obviously got a backing on it, so it doesn't need a rear grease seal. I've only got one bearing number that I can see, and that's on this one, and there's two numbers. We've got Foxtrot -25, and we've also got Foxtrot -557717. I'll go with the blind hole bearing first. So to press it into place, we're going to take a socket that fits perfectly on the outer race only, without putting any stress or strain on the innards, and just a little extension to give us a bit of distance on the press. Now getting this set up is awkward, I won't lie to you. It might have been easier if I took this electric bypass valve off, maybe not. Just get in there any way you can. Okay, so funny story, we're on my workbench again a few days later, and you might notice there's the old bearing, and there's this, which was one of the new bearings actually. And remember that bit where I said, oh yeah, definitely make sure you don't put it in upside down? Well, yeah, I started putting it in upside down like an idiot, and obviously, as we spoke about, the only way you can get them out is to destroy them, so I am here with a new bearing again, a couple of days later, minus £48. Let's try again, shall we? So this time we're going to try really, really hard to get it the right way round. And it's a very awkward reach in because it's obviously on the press and there's not a lot of room in this casing. So the orange part is obviously the oil seal, and that's what needs to be facing outwards. And that's the bearing with just one oil seal, which goes into the blind hole. Then I've got a 1/2 inch drive extension and a 19mm Halford socket. And we need to get that aligned nicely so it's just sitting on top of the bearing. And I'm going to start inching the press down just to take the strain. And the extension's a bit more centred under the press. So without further ado, let's apply some pressure. And that seems to be going in pretty nicely. Now, it's important that these bearings go into a certain clearance, and that is 55,000th of an inch, i.e. 0.055 of an inch, which equates to roughly 1.4 millimetres. So now we're going to get our little depth gauge out and we'll start seeing roughly how much we need to carry on by. So if you can see down the bottom of there, that's still a little bit proud, which is fine. I'm erring on the side of caution. We're going to use the other end of this caliper, which actually has a sliding depth gauge in the tip, look. That there is 1.4 millimetres of depth, and so on and so forth. That comes out. So that's how we're going to measure it. So if we open it wider first, we'll set the depth gauge out, and then we can put that on the lip of the bearing, push the outer piece of the gauge down, and then that will give us our depth reading. Right, that's not too bad. 1.36, I'll take that. I'm not going to get that any more accurate with the press there. The press is a little bit cumbersome. So we'll go with that, that's fine. Next up then is the through hole bearing, and you'll notice this has got a green and an orange seal on it, and this little ring with the lip, ring with the lip is actually a very slightly smaller diameter than the main bearing race. This is so that you can put it forward into the hole and it will sit nicely up to this lip, and then you can start pressing, and that gives you a good square front to start pressing with. Obviously I should really have noticed that on the other one, but I didn't. So if you can see in the bottom there, if I put the green piece towards the outside, then that bearing actually sits straight square in that hole like that, and it's much easier to press into position because of that sort of very slightly narrower locating ring on the bearing front. Same sort of process then, a little bit of rigmarole getting the bearing all set up. Same again then, just a couple of little pumps to take up that slack, and we'll just apply the smallest amount of tension to the socket drive. And then before we start pressing, this is where we'll get it really nicely aligned. Okay, so the press is lined up a bit nicer now, and we'll carry on pressing this bearing into place. and I can already feel with my finger that one's barely below the surface at all. Let's see just how little it's down there by. So it's in there by 0.27 of a millimetre at the moment. So there's a little bit more work to go on that. Just over a millimetre more. Let's carry on. Yeah, 1 millimetre pretty much on the dot nearly. Let's take a couple more measurements just to be sure. Got a 1.1 there. And another 1.1 there as well. So just the tiniest tweak really is what I'm after, but I'm in danger of overshooting. I think we'll go through with it anyway. Let's give it another go. One more go. .55, it's a little deeper than it really should be, I suppose. 0.15 over of a millimetre. It's not my best work, but well, there's not really an easy way of getting it out anymore. So that'll be where that sits then, I suppose. So now what we're going to go with is reassembling the Supercharger basically. So we're going to take the main casing and we're going to fit the rotor pack in, bearing in mind that one of these bearings is the open one, which the longer shaft of the rotor pack needs to pass through, which is on this side. So we put the rotor pack in and then we're going to put the gear casing over the top and we're going to apply sealant to both of those parts, put the bolts in and tighten it all up. The recommended sealant for this job is Loctite 518. Now I've got 510, which is a very similar product. This is slightly runnier, but it's slightly more resistant to high temperatures and it boasts slightly greater chemical resistance as well. So it's not quite the right product, but it possibly might do a bit better even. So we're going to use that. Unfortunately, I've moved garages a few times over the last couple of years and I've lost the applicator, so I'm going to use this little medical syringe just to run a bead round. I've taken the liberty of wire brushing the bolts already and they're all prepped and ready to go. So let's get started, let's do that. So again, scrupulously clean, the rotor pack has all been degreased and cleaned down. So I'm going to leave that slightly proud because now I want to run a bead of sealant around this edge really. Same again for this gear cover then, we're going to run a bead of sealant around it, but you might have noticed that I kind of double ran the sealant on the gear pack, and that's because the Supercharger's main job is to develop boost pressure for the engine. So in there it's going to start generating highly pressurised intake air. So I wanted a good seal around this edge to ensure that we don't end up with a boost leak from around the flange of the Supercharger. In this case I'm going to run a slightly thinner bead because I only need to just seal this ever so slightly just to keep the oil in, and I don't want any excess sealant getting into the gear casing where it's then going to contaminate the gearing and the bearings and wear everything out faster. So I just need enough just to seal the flange for the oil. This should cure instantly anaerobically where there's no oxygen. It's an anaerobic sealant, that's what it's designed to do. But to err on the side of caution, I am going to leave this overnight before refilling with oil. So a very thin bead on this cover. So the oil drain hole goes towards the bottom of the casing. These two top holes are larger to accommodate the steel anyway. So you might remember we made a special note, we marked these areas blue for these silver bolts with the threaded end holes in, and then the rest with the 3 black bolts. Now that those are nipped up, it's obviously time to torque them, and I'm just going to very quickly pop the Supercharger drain plug in, only loosely, just to stop any dirt or dust getting in there while I leave this to cure overnight, and then refill with oil tomorrow. So as for torque on these 6 bolts, it's obviously important because it's clamping the sort of end case in and the rotor pack in and sealing the oil in. They do quite a lot, these little 6 bolts. But I couldn't find any decent specifications for them, so I've just gone with 20 Newton meters, which is sort of based off the fact that they're M6, they're going into aluminium. I think that'll be about right, so that'll do for today. We've got our anaerobic sealant in. Again, it should cure pretty much instantly really, but I'm going to leave it overnight to be sure. Don't want any oil leaks and that. I'll give it its best chance it can to fully seal and then fill it up tomorrow. Okay, so it's the next day. We've given this a bit of time to cure overnight, and I'm just going to wipe off the excess sealant and then get it filled up with oil. This is our new oil then, so it's a synthetic turbine oil and it meets the specifications as shown on the bottle there. Don't actually know what specific product is in here. They've obviously bought like a larger quantity, 20 litre, 5 litre can or whatever, and just decant it and sell it off by the bottle. But that's fine. It saved me having a can of fluid that I'm never going to use kicking around. Recommended fill quantity, 150 millilitres. There's conflicting information out there. It might be slightly more, like 155 as this is supplied, or it might be slightly less, 140, something like that. But obviously some's going to be better than none, and most of the things I've read all say 150. So after making allowances for the little bit of oil that's been in the tube and for the tiny dreg that's left in the bottle, that's going to be around 5 millilitres I'd say that we've left out, and we've probably got about 150 in there. I'm going to call that full now and seal it up. So I had some more microphone technical difficulties while filming this little scene. So all I'm doing is attempting to fit this new pulley to the Supercharger snout. So you can obviously refit your old pulley if that's all you're after. I've gone for a Paramount Performance smaller pulley. I think it's about 10% smaller, which will drive the Supercharger faster. The issue with that is they very commonly catch on the snout casting. I think the snout casting was changed a little bit over the years, but ultimately, because it's cast, it's a rough piece and they all vary a little. Now of course I want as much metal on the snout as I can because that'll be stronger and it'll support the bearings better and be more resistant to the load, etc. But I'm going to test fit this pulley, and if I start to sort of see any resistance on the pressure gauge on the press, I'll know it's starting to bind, so we'll see how we go. So pressing the pulley on, we support the bottom of the shaft with a socket, and that will stop the bearing being pushed out of the assembled shaft and snout area while the pulley is pressed into place. You can alternatively heat this pulley with something like oxyacetylene to get a sort of shrink fit on there. I've opted to use the press, so that's what we're going with. And you'll see fairly soon, or maybe now even, that the pulley has started to bind on the snout, so we've had to abandon this and we're going to have to put the puller back on it and pull the pulley off. Then once the pulley's pulled off, we'll have to just very gently remove some material and smooth out the casting a little bit to ensure that we've got space to fit the pulley. I measured it with a micrometer, and the pulley is approximately 45 millimeters in thickness, and then that's 45 millimeters of snout material that you need to remove, which very handily does stop short of the webbing on the snout. So you don't have to remove any of the strengthening webbing. You're literally just sort of rounding and smoothing out the casting marks right on the nose where the pulley will sit. So we've had a bit of a tidy up on the bench, but we've also been removing material from the snout area. So there's not really an exact science to it. I've been using this rasp, which is very coarse, ideal for removing aluminium because it doesn't get clogged up. And then I've just dressed it off with this bit of sandpaper to get a relatively uniform, smooth finish. We're going to try and refit the pulley again, and if needs be, we'll remove a bit more material. Of course, we're doing this by hand. It's much less aggressive than using a machine tool like an angle grinder or whatever. Aluminium is very soft anyway, so it's not taking too much effort. So we're just going to get it all vacuumed up and brake cleaned and cleaned up. Try and refit the pulley and see whether or not we've got the right sort of space, tolerance, clearance and what have you. The good news is the pulley is fitted to the shaft and it spins freely. Obviously we supported that end with a socket, and then we pressed with a piece of wood on top, sacrificial, just to bring the shaft totally flush with the nose of the pulley. And then if you look down this back end, hopefully you can sort of see there just how tight that clearance is. There really isn't a lot of space down here at the back of the pulley, but that's all right. Think of it less of removing material and more like smoothing out the casting marks, and that's roughly the sort of amount of material you need to take off. As I say, something very coarse like that rasp was very good because it didn't clog up like a file might. But that's the pulley pressed on, so then we can pop the snout on the Supercharger and that will be the rebuild finished. So the observant ones amongst you will notice there's still no dry flange on my Charger. So if you're starting to feel a bit deja vu-y, but we're going to take a small amount of grease. We're going to pre-grease the flange and the splines because we want them to slide together nicely. And then wipe off the excess. And we're going to press this on with the aid of our press, obviously. When we're pressing it on, of course, pressing this is going to probably stress the bearing out a little bit. So we're going to be very careful not to put any undue force onto this. Set up in the press then. We'll just take the tension, make sure everything's aligned. The socket is reasonably central, which will allow the shaft to pass through the middle. And what I'm keeping an eye on as I'm pressing is obviously the drive flange, but also that pressure gauge. And we're just starting to see a little flicker of pressure now as the flange becomes seated fully home. So if I go up to a ton there, I think that should be the drive flange fully seated without putting undue load on those bearings at the rear. So the drive flange is pressed on to the actual main body of the Charger, and the snout is down this end ready to go. And the only thing we're missing is a Supercharger coupler. Now they go in with the plastic piece facing downwards and it locates on the 3 holes. And then the snout coupling is designed to go into the open slots instead. So that's it. Before we just bolt the snout down, we obviously need to run a bead of silicone around here, and I'm going to pay particular attention to this coupling area because the mode of failure on my last bearings was that all the grease had pushed out into this cavity, suggesting that I might have had a boost leak maybe along this edge. So I'm going to probably go a little bit heavier than I should on the silicone around this area to preserve this bearing and hopefully get a bit more life out of it than previous. Ready for final assembly then, we're going to use 3 different fluids. We've got copper grease, we've got Loctite 270, which is high strength Threadlocker, and we've got some black RTV silicone gasket. So the Supercharger bolts are all plain shouldered bolts, with the notable exception of this one particular blackened bolt. Now this one goes inside the snout assembly into that bolt hole down there. Now obviously that's slightly different than the others. All the others are on the outside, so that particular bolt I'm going to thread lock, and it did have Threadlocker on it from factory as well. Obviously if that comes loose it's going to trash the Supercharger at least, and potentially trash the engine. The other ones, I'm going to put a bit of copper grease on these dowels here, because these are steel dowels in 2 pieces of aluminium, and we all know what happens there. There's a corresponding dowel on the back end over here, and that one's actually in the snout at the moment. So a bit of copper grease on the dowels, Loctite on the internal one, and of course our bead of silicone, gasketing the whole thing before we put it together. Torque setting is going to be 25 Newton meters, which again is not a specific correct torque setting as such, but it's just one that I've kind of decided on after reading various conflicting reports on the internet. So let's give it a go. Okay, so with the unit reassembled and rotating the drive pulley, you can hear a faint tapping just from the coupler lashing back and forth, which is to be expected, but the noise from the rotor bearing has gone. So I definitely had the open-ended rotor bearing failed, the one that's where the coupler sits, and going in there and renewing that bearing was definitely a good move. What I do have is a fair amount of excess silicone sealant in here. Don't know if I'll be able to show you that, so I'm just going to reach in and smooth that out a little bit. If you can see in there's a fairly decent bead, so I'm just going to smooth that out. The very last piece of the puzzle then, as far as the Supercharger is concerned, is the intake manifolds, which bolt to the side of the Supercharger. They've got steel locating dowels, so I've gone ahead and put a little bit of copper grease on those, on the charger itself and on the manifold. But looking at these, they've got some pretty powdery corrosion on where the intake gaskets go, and also where the top of the charge cooler gasket goes as well. So we're just going to rub this with a little bit of Scotch-Brite, clean up the powderiness, and then give it a clean out inside before we bolt it back together. Because if we clean it once it's back on, then all that dust is going to end up either in the engine or in the Supercharger. So let's do that then. Now I paid particular attention to the little Symposer mounting there because we're going to do something with that, but that'll be in another video. We're going to get rid of it basically, but we'll clean it up while we're here and rinse and repeat for the other side. So those three inside are all T40 to 25 Newton meters, and just don't forget about its little 10mm friend down here. It's a bit hidden and a bit out of the way. Thanks very much for watching today's episode of Guzzoline Garage then. It's a bit choppy and changey. I know it's not the smoothest one I've done, and that's because it just took a few days really to get some new bits ordered here and there. Some things I wasn't quite expecting and what have you, but it's all done. That is, long story short, or just a long story actually, how to overhaul an Eaton TVS 1900 Supercharger. Obviously in this case it's the one fitted to the Jaguar F-Type, but it should apply really to several other makes and models as well. Hope you found it useful. Please subscribe, drop a like, let me know in the comments if you'd have done anything differently or you think I've done anything outrageously wrong. There's a bit of guesswork involved there because the specifications for certain torques and how much oil and things like that are a little bit conflicting. It's hard to find the exact information relating to this specific model. But yeah, thanks very much, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye bye.